So what I want to do today, I had asked you to read, and I told you didn't have to have everything read till Friday, but I had asked you to read through some of the things from Thomas Jefferson and all of George Washington. And I want to talk about Washington today and why I think he's so important. I think he's an absolutely fascinating figure in all kinds of ways. And I want to start off by looking at this paragraph we have on page 201 from him, where he gives us his first inaugural. And towards the end of that first inaugural, he really stresses the necessity of understanding the natural law and what that role is within American society and what it means to an American republic. And we're going to talk about a couple of different nuances in here, but let's just look at it. So this is on page 201, that first full paragraph, where he says, "I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature." Now, anybody want to take a guess? What's he mean by that? What's the economy and course of nature? Anybody recognize these terms at all? You might remember them from Western Heritage. So these were terms that were used to try and describe God's distribution of his own grace during the Middle Ages. This is a very medieval way of thinking. And so this idea was that you see throughout all the Middle Ages, at least in the Western Church, this idea that God, being perfect in and of himself, is also perfectly the distributor of his grace, his will. So his grace being the same as his will being his grace. And he distributes these things. Obviously, himself is perfect, but then beyond that, according to the nature of the thing. So there's a certain grace that's given to the angels. There's a certain grace that's given to women and men. There's a certain grace that's given to the animals. But all things in the economy and course of nature, from the highest thing of perfection, God, all the way down to the lowest thing, are connected in some way. So there's no part of the created world that is not in some manner tied to the Creator ultimately. Now, this isn't pantheism, nothing like that, but it is a recognition that God's grace animates all things. So the very fact in him I move and live and have our being, the very fact I'm breathing at the moment, the fact that I'm speaking at the moment is an act of grace. And it's important because Washington is using very philosophical terms to try and understand what our role within the republic is. So in the economy and course of nature, there is an indissoluble union, and I can't stress that enough for Washington. There is no caveat here. He doesn't temper this. It is an unbreakable union, always, between virtue and happiness. So you may think you're happy, but you're not really happy unless you're satisfied. And you're not really satisfied unless you have done something properly and done it well. So we can't be happy without being virtuous. You may think you're happy because you own a lot of stuff or you're comfortable, but Washington is telling us it doesn't work that way. The only true happiness we ever experience comes from our hard work being a gift of God's grace that our will then becomes commensurate with in some mysterious fashion that we don't quite understand. But God's grace is there. Our will is to submit ourselves to God's grace and to do the right thing. So there is an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, and there can never be one without the other. But it's a slow process then. You think about all the choices we make all the time. And when they are taken together, they add up to be a good, but they're slow. The choices that we make are slow because we choose not to do the wrong thing. We choose to do the right thing. And that means our path is often circuitous as we're moving along God's grace. So, once again, there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage. Or he might have said between duty and rights. There is no such thing as a right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness without a corresponding duty. That is, I have a duty to treat you with dignity. I have a duty to treat you well. I have a duty to see you as also an indispensable part of the economy and the course of nature. between duty and advantage, between the rewards of public prosperity, slow over time, and felicity, right? Happiness, again. There is no happiness without this. Since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right. Why would we ever think that God will bless us if we have not blessed him? Why will he ever do for us if we have not lived according to his own law? Washington is throwing the gauntlet down here. This is an absolutely serious way of understanding it. Now, think back for a moment to the Western heritage. Who does Washington sound like in all of this? What figure does he sound like? Does he sound Roman? Does he sound Greek? We've already stressed he's got some medieval in him. Who talked about decorum and the natural law? Yeah, Annie.
Cicero?
Absolutely, Cicero. This is straight out of Cicero. Right? This is on duties. Remember, on duties, you always have the duty to treat one another with dignity and respect. Right? Then we can talk about your rights. But you can never have rights until you performed your duty. You have to be a woman or a man first before you actually have any rights. That's Cicero. And to talk about the eternal order, to talk about eternal rules of order and right, this is straight out of Cicero, which heaven itself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the republican model of government are justly considered as deeply and perhaps finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. No pressure. But you've just been given the first republic we've seen in the world in 2,000 years of any consequence. And you better not mess it up. Right? Because if you mess it up, it's going to be messed up for generations to come, for maybe the next 2,000 years. So this could be our final moment here. So I can't stress the importance enough of this paragraph. Washington is really defining, beyond what the Declaration of Independence said, he's really defining the role of the individual person within larger society. So we have to do the right thing no matter the cost. We have to expect that when we do the right thing, things will work out, but rarely do they work out immediately. There's going to be a slowness to this. Real community takes hard work. Hard work takes time and good moral decisions. And so we can't be expedient about this, and we can't think in terms of expediency. We can only think in terms of right and wrong. So government for George Washington, much like what you had with William Penn when you looked at him, government is based on the free will of citizens, but it is based on us using our free will to make moral decisions at all times, in all places, and in all ways. And we can never expect to do wrong and to gain a right out of that. So I'm going to turn to something else, something you don't have. Hopefully in the next edition of the Reader, we'll put this in, but it's not in the Reader as you have it. I want to read to you from a speech that John Quincy Adams gave on April 29th of 1839. Now, I don't know how many of you are that familiar with John Quincy Adams. We wouldn't have talked about him yet at all in American heritage. He's president number 6 in American history. He is a terrible president. Really just a wretched president, but he is a great man. And that's always a bit of a problem where you have a truly great man who just cannot get the presidency right. But he had been a great Secretary of State, maybe the best Secretary of State we've ever had in our history. He's the one who negotiated with Spain. He negotiated with Great Britain. He's the reason that we have the Canadian border that we have. John Quincy Adams did everything he could to make sure that that border was demilitarized. It's why we don't keep a navy in the Great Lakes at all, which, you think about that, that's pretty wild. Very few countries would do that. And up until 2002, the Canadian border with the United States was free. You could cross at will. Up until 2002, the Patriot Act and 9/11 changed all of that. But for a brief span, for about 180 years, it was the freest border in the history of the world. There had never been anything like it, and that's all John Quincy Adams was able to do. After his presidency, though, he leaves the presidency in 1829 and hands it over to Andrew Jackson. after his presidency, he goes through a period, understandably, of immense depression and believes that he's been a failure to the American people. He thinks he's a failure to his father. His father has passed away in 1826, but he still knows the memory of his father. His father had been the second president of the United States, certainly one of the great founders. And Quincy Adams really has no idea what he's going to do with himself until a friend says, you really still want to be a public servant? Why don't you go into the House of Representatives? And so he goes from the highest office in the land, the President of the United States, to the lowest office in the land. But he becomes then, just as he was a great Secretary of State, he becomes a really great member of the House of Representatives, arguably one of the best members of the House in the history of the House. He's a great orator, amazing guy. Even, this is great for him. He dies on the House floor. He's just given a speech and he falls dead after that. And it's the way he wanted to go. He even gave some famous last words. I can't remember what they are right now, but it wasn't just he actually said something worth saying. And then he died, and he was very happy to have done that. He died in service to his country, which meant everything to him. But on April 29th of 1839, he's asked to give a speech to commemorate the 50th anniversary of George Washington taking the oath of office for the first time. And if you look this up, you don't have to. I'm just going to read to you the first paragraph. But it's always interesting to me if you look this speech up. The speech is 72 pages long. And I don't know if John Quincy Adams actually gave the whole thing in one moment. It would not be totally impossible. This is a time period where a sermon given by a preacher could be anywhere upwards of 6 hours long. So it was a day and age in which oration was the art form and was entertainment, and Quincy Adams was one of the best of the orators. But I'm only going to read the first page, so don't worry, I'm not going to give you all 72 pages. And the first part's boilerplate, but then you're going to see it gets really interesting. I'd like you to just kind of listen to the language and think about what influences there might have been on Quincy Adams as he writes this. He begins by saying, "Would it be an unlicensed trespass of the imagination to conceive that on the night preceding the day of which you now commemorate the 50th anniversary, on the night preceding the 30th of April, 1789, when from the balcony of your city hall, the Chancellor of the State of New York administered to George Washington the solemn oath faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States, and to the best of his ability to preserve, to protect, and to defend the Constitution of the United States." All right, that's, by the time you get to 1839, that language is known by everybody. This idea of preserving and protecting and defending the Constitution of the United States, that's the boilerplate. But then he gets really, really interesting. He says, "Might we imagine that in the visions of the night, the guardian angel of the father of our country appeared before him in the venerated form of his mother, and to cheer and encourage him in the performance of the momentous and solemn duties that Washington was about to assume, delivered to him a suit of celestial armor. She gave to him a helmet consisting of the principles of piety, of justice, of honor, and of benevolence, with which from his earliest infancy he had hitherto walked through life in the presence of all of his brethren. She gave to him a spear studded with the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence. She gave to him a sword, the same with which he led the armies of his country through the War of Freedom to the summit of the triumphal arc of independence. A corselet of long experience she gave him, and habitual intercourse in peace and war with the world of mankind, his contemporaries of the human race, in all their stages of civilization. And last but not least, she gave to him the Constitution of the United States, itself a shield embossed by heavenly hands with the future history of its country written upon it." All right, that's pretty great in all kinds of ways. And I would give so much for any one of our politicians today to be able to speak like that. But what's Quincy Adams doing here? What do you recognize in this? Annie?
He's talking like Paul. I don't know that.
Talk about that for a moment.
I mean, he's
It sounds like St. Paul.
Yeah.
Right? How?
He's saying like I'm not going to remember which part.
That's okay.
Like the sword of righteousness.
It's Ephesians.
The breastplate, the breastplate of something or something.
Yeah.
But the virtues correspond to different parts of the armor.
Yeah. Yeah, I brought it in so we could talk about this. But yeah, this is Paul, Ephesians 6. Right? This is exactly what he says to the church in Ephesus. He says, "Finally, brethren, be strengthened in the Lord and in the might of his power. Put you on the armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the deceits of the wicked one. For our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the world of darkness, against the spirit of wickedness in the high places. Therefore take unto you the armor of God, that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and to stand in all things perfect. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about you with truth, having on the breastplate of justice, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And in all things taking the shield of faith, wherewith you may be able to extinguish all the fiery darts of the most wicked one. And take unto you the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit." So is John Quincy Adams plagiarizing? What's he doing here? Why that passage? And would his audience have been familiar with that? Yeah, this would have been in the air they breathed. Right? They would have had the King James Version of the Bible, and they would have known this intimately. And of course, it's not just you put on this armor, but there's also a true fight going on here, just as George Washington had said in that paragraph we just looked at, that we have to obey the eternal rules of order and right, and must always do what's right. This is not just about us here and now. It's a fight for all of humanity. And that's a lot to put on your shoulders. All right, so Washington is being equated here with St. Paul in some way. Anybody catch, there's some other mythological references as well that fit into this. Abby?
So the last part about the people of the future on the shield is a reference to Aeneas from the Aeneid.
Yeah.
He rises from, it's a really good scene.
Yeah, and I brought that in as well.
Yeah.
Right? This is a very powerful moment. So let's talk about this for just a moment. One of the great stories of Western civilization is the story of the Aeneid by Virgil, which is itself a rewriting from the Roman perspective of the Iliad. So you've got this long tradition of these tales. The Aeneid is this story in which Aeneas, our hero, is left with a devastated culture. The Greeks come in through this trick by the Trojan horse. They come into Troy, and in the middle of the night, they leave the horse and they slaughter the women and the children of the community. And Aeneas is able to get together a few of men, and they have a couple of ships, and they leave their city of Troy, which was this great virtuous city. They leave the city of Troy, and they go off being offered by Jupiter a new realm somewhere, but they have to search for it. And so for 3 years, they go off in search of this new realm, and they go through all kinds of, they go to hell, literally. They go to North Africa. There's this woman involved, Dido. It's a great story. It's a totally tragic story. Dido commits suicide after she becomes a witch. This is not a good thing. And the men keep going, and they finally land on the Tiber in Italy, where they believe they've been promised the city, but when they get there, there are native peoples there. There are the Latins. And Jupiter decides at this point that he's not going to be involved any longer in this, even though he had already promised Aeneas that they would be given this land. Now his wife, that is Jupiter's wife, and his daughter Venus are fighting over this, and so Jupiter just stands back, and he says, I'm not going to get involved, especially with my two favorite women at odds with one another, so my promise to Aeneas is off. So Aeneas is betrayed by the gods, and not just by any god, but by the god of the gods. Little does Aeneas know, but he himself is half god. His mother is Venus, and it's really important it's Venus, because she is the goddess of love. So there's going to be a relationship here to Aphrodite, there's a relationship to Mary, there's a relationship to the Lady of the Lake in the Arthurian legends. There are all kinds of things that play out in this. And so in Book 8 of the Aeneid, Venus descends onto Earth, and she brings with her a number of gifts. In other words, she makes good on her father's promise of helping Aeneas. And this is how, and I'm reading from the latest edition from the Fagel's translation, which is one of my favorites. And by the way, guys, this if you have not read this, I promise you, this is as good as The Lord of the Rings. It is an incredible incredible story. One of the greatest stories certainly I've ever read, and it was hugely influential in the founding period, as you'll see here in just a moment, and what's clear from John Quincy Adams. The goddess Venus, lustrous among the cloud banks, bears her gifts, and she approaches her son when she spots him alone in a glade, off in the stream's frigid recess. She hails him and suddenly appears before him. Look, just forged to perfection by my husband. Her husband is Vulcan, the god of metal. By my husband's skill, the gifts that I promised. There will be no need now, my son, for you to flinch from fighting those swaggering Latins or to challenge their savagery in a duel. And with that, Venus reaches to embrace her son, and she sets by the armor near under an oak tree. Aeneas takes delight in the goddess's gifts and in the honor of it all, and his eyes run across them piece by piece. He cannot get enough of them. He's filled with wonder. He turns them over, now with his hands, now with his arms. That terrible crested helmet, plumed with shooting fire, the sword blade honed to skill, the breastplate made of solid bronze, blood red and immense, like a blue cloud inflamed by the sun's rays and gleaming through the heavens. The burnished greaves of electrum, smelted gold, and the spear. But it was the shield, the workmanship of that shield. No words could ever describe it. For there upon the shield was written the entire story of Italy, Rome in all of her triumphs. There Vulcan had forged them, for he was well aware of all the seers, and he was schooled in all the times and prophets to come. And in the order he wrote their generations and described all the wars that they would wage and all the land that they would conquer. That's incredible. It's incredible writing, but just beautiful translation too. And this understanding, here is Venus. So this is what John Quincy Adams is getting at. He's basically saying that we must mix the Judeo-Christian with the Greco-Roman in order to understand the American founding and understand that figure of George Washington. All right, I've got one other question about this, and you would have to be as nerdy as I am to get this, but did anybody catch the reference to walking with the spear studded with the Declaration of Independence written upon it? Anybody catch that one? Got one other mythology thrown in. This is Norse mythology. And Odin, who's Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, Odin, who walks around as this figure of gray, is so wise, number one, because he plucks out one of his eyes and he wants to make sure that he sees the world not as men do, but as gods do, without depth perception. And he also has his staff that he carries with him. And on his staff comes from the tree of creation, and on it is written the entire natural law. And that's why he can judge cases. That's why he's so wise, because he has that written upon it. So the declaration here is the natural law in John Quincy Adams' mythologizing. It's just incredible to pull all of that together. And an audience in 1839 would have gotten all of that. That is equally stunning, that an audience would have been receptive to a speech like this. But I want you to keep that in mind, that this is how they think of George Washington. What is he? What do early Americans think of him as? Is he just some guy who came along? He's a Roman demigod. That's how they think of him. And he was by far the most important person of his day and age. It is the age of Washington. There was no greater figure than Washington. He was the great man of his day. And we're going to see that over and over again. And there are things that he does that are very important. But Washington is this great figure. And nobody could have made the founding go the way that it did. Nobody could have made the presidency work like George Washington did. It was his strength of character. So when he says things like there is an indissoluble union between happiness and virtue, we have to take him seriously. This is not just rhetoric on his part. He attempted to live this out every day of his life. And he had his flaws, incredible flaws. Anyone know what one of his great flaws was? And it's not totally his fault. But he and Alexander Hamilton were considered the two best-looking men of their day. And women flocked to Washington and flocked to Alexander Hamilton. And Washington was not immune from their charms. He was pretty happy that all these women paid attention to him like that. And there were definitely times in his own relationships, we don't think he ever consummated any of them, but he definitely had some relationships that kind of pushed the boundary of what was proper and what wasn't in his own day and age. He had a temper like you wouldn't believe, that he had a very difficult time controlling. So there were things that he definitely was flawed about, and he knew those, but he also worked very hard to overcome a lot of that. Annie?
I had a question and a comment.
Sure.
The question is, I wasn't listening for this when you read it, but does John Quincy Adams replace some of Paul's language with Aristotelian virtues rather than
Yes,
Christian?
he's definitely, he's absolutely meshing the Greco-Roman with the Judeo-Christian. And I'm happy if you want to email me later, Annie, I can send you the speech, or I can send you to anybody that you guys want. I'm happy to, or I'll make a copy of it and give it to you all on Friday. But yeah, the way that he does that is genius. It also, it's interesting, which came first, Virgil or the Bible? At least the New Testament, right? Virgil did. Paul had to have known. That's a whole nother topic, but I'm fascinated by that. Paul had to have known when he wrote, right? I'm not taking anything away from Paul, but when he's speaking to the Ephesians, clearly he's using language they would have known. And taking that scene from the Emea is a stunning moment, really, in Scripture. It's an incredible moment. I think that makes Scripture more interesting. That doesn't take away from it, but yeah, it is interesting in and of itself. Okay, and you said you had a comment as well?
My comment is, it's interesting that they thought of Washington as a sort of demigod figure rather than like more messianic. Like, I feel like that's more common now with great leaders, that they're sort of seen as a messiah figure, but he's more just seen as a...
No, he's the suffering hero rather than the messianic. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. That would be a really interesting paper. Your senior year, that would be fascinating on the nature of heroism and how that plays itself out. Yeah, no, great comment. Okay, so what does Washington do in his life that really matters for us? Anybody want to, just two things he does that show his leadership skill? What two things do we know? Annie, go ahead.
He steps down.
Yes, when?
At the end of 2 terms.
At the end of 2 terms. Why? Why does he say 8 years is enough? It's purely tradition. Catherine?
Because the people need to realize that he's not a king, and that they need to get used to the changes.
He's a republican.
Right.
He's not a king. This is a republic, not an empire. So 2 terms is enough. Why 8 years, though? Anyone? Why that? And it's the other great thing he did. How long was the American Revolution? It was 8 years. He was general for 8 years. And that's enough. 8 years as general, 8 years as president. No man, no woman, no person needs more than that. You can do what you need to do. And so the model that I've written on the board, who is the great model for Washington, and Washington is known as the American Achilles, he's the American Cicero, he's the American Aeneas, but he's also the American Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, we don't know if he ever actually lived or not. We only have stories about him from Livy in the early history of Rome. And the story of Cincinnatus is this, and I'm not going to get all the details right. Every year I do this, I tend to look it up, and I forget to look it up when I come to this, so I apologize. But the story is that during the Republic of Rome, Rome is laid under siege. And the tradition was that whenever Rome is under siege, and remember, it's never invaded until 410. That's the first time the walls of Rome are breached, when St. Augustine is alive. But long before that, for 1,000 years, it had not been breached. And whenever it was under siege, Rome would suspend its constitution, and they would elect one-man dictator, and he would be given, say, 3 months to take care of whatever problem it was. And at the end of that time, he has to step down. Well, Cincinnatus, who's a farmer, is so good at what he does that he's able to accomplish the task within 1 month rather than 3 months. And the people of Rome are so impressed with him, kind of a messianic figure, that they vote to permanently suspend the Constitution and make Cincinnatus dictator. Now, this is where it's clearly mythological and not historical. Supposedly, he stands in the city square of Rome, in the middle of everyone, and he tells them, basically, I spit on you. Anybody who would give their freedom up for a man does not deserve either the man or their freedom. I want nothing to do with you. And supposedly he takes his sword and he throws it to the ground. And this is where it's clearly mythological. He picks up his plow. Like, why he had his plow with him in town doesn't really make sense. But he picks up his plow and he says, I want nothing more to do with you. I will spend the rest of my days farming. And he takes off and no one sees him again. And that's the great story of what every model Republican should do. You do your duty. Whenever you're asked to serve, you never turn it down. But the moment you've served, you step down. It's enough. You don't need 4 terms as president. You don't need 4 terms as Congress. You don't need any. You do what you do and you step down. Right? That's the rule in a republic. And that tradition, of course, is carried on until the 1930s. Well, we don't need a law for it. It's the tradition. It's good enough for Washington. It's good enough for every president. That only changes in the 1930s. And now, of course, it's a constitutional amendment that you can't serve more than 2 terms, but that's because the tradition is violated. So what does Washington do? Washington also stepped down at the end of his generalship. And I want to tell you a quick story about this. And this is where we have to be historians, and you have to be able to place yourself in. Steve Smith.
How you doing, man?
We're just talking about the Emea and George Washington. Do you guys all know Dr. Smith? Oh, he's the ultimate. He's my dean. He's godfather to one of my children.
And he's on sabbatical.
Yeah, I'm on sabbatical and teaching. Right, yeah.
Paradoxical thing.
Yeah, but look at, can you believe this, Steve? I mean, it's an American history class, and I bring the Emea in.
Nice.
How great is that?
That's awesome.
All right, good seeing you.
Arms in the net.
Everybody take classes from Dr. Smith. Bye, Steve. So, you have to put yourself in the mindset of these people. And I apologize, for those of us wearing glasses, you're going to see why this was not a good thing at the time. So, in the 1780s and 1770s, 1790s, it was always inappropriate for a man, this was not true for a woman, but it was always inappropriate for a man to ever admit any failings at all in terms of physical health. So I could be, it sounds like a Monty Python skit, but I could be standing there with my limbs falling off my body, and if someone said, Brad, how are you doing? I would have to respond, fine, sir, I'm fine. You just never, it was just considered undignified to show any weakness, and eyeglasses were seen as a very private thing. So it was okay to wear eyeglasses in your study or in your bedroom, but you would never wear them out in public. People like Franklin could get away with it because he was a total eccentric and weirdo, but others could not. Even George Washington could not get away with wearing eyeglasses in public, and it's still being respected. It would be, and I forgive the image, but it would be like any one of us showing up in class in our underwear. It's that private. You don't do that. And so you never show any weakness at all. Now, that's going to be important here in a little bit. So Washington, at the end of the war, goes back to Mount Vernon. He's still general and he's still in charge, but he leaves his armed forces in Newburgh, New York, near where West Point is today. And he goes down to Mount Vernon to spend his time with his wife, with Martha, whom he loves dearly. And the army, sitting in Newburgh, is getting very, very restless. It's now 1783. The war has been over since 1781, but Congress has not disbanded them legally yet because there's no treaty signed with Britain. We're still negotiating the treaty, and so the army has to stay in, and you've got all this officer corps that's sitting there, and they're getting really, really agitated. Congress is not being effective. They're not getting the treaty done. They're not paying them, so they're sitting there without pay. And our army, true story, our army starts talking about overthrowing Congress. It's an ineffective institution. And this is where, as Americans, we are utterly open, even about our own stupidity at times. They start, and rather than trying to hide this, the military starts publishing newspaper editorials telling Congress, we're going to march on you and disband you unless you take care of this, this, and this. In other words, they're totally open. There's going to be a coup, and you guys are going to be done. So they're not hiding it at all. But of course, news gets back to Washington, and Washington immediately gets on his horse, and he rides as fast as he can to Newburgh, New York, and he calls all of his officers together. And remember, this was his army. These are his men. He created this thing out of whole cloth during the American Revolution. And he calls all of his men together, and he says, we will have a meeting on the morning of March 15th of 1783. Why does March 15th matter? Abby?
The Ides of March.
It's the Ides of March, right? This is not in any way accidental. We are meeting on the Ides of March, and Washington gives the greatest speech of his life, even better than the one we just read in the first inaugural. And I'm not going to read it all, but he says, I beg you men to understand that Congress is doing the best that she can. And, he says, let me conjure you in the name of our common country. And I want you to understand here that this is different than the country Washington talked about in the inaugural address. If you remember, he says, in our country. Here, when he says in our country, it's capital C. And that means the country of all good men and women who have ever lived or ever will live. That's the way country was used at this time. So country is not just America. It's the republic of all good men and women of goodwill throughout all of time, past, present, and future, and we have a duty to them. So let me conjure you in the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor and as you respect the rights of humanity and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation at the man who wishes under any specious pretenses to overturn the liberties of our country. So, beautiful technique of oratory. It's the people right in front of him who are about to launch the coup, and he addresses them as though it's someone else. You would never do that, you men, right? That's somebody else is thinking about doing this. He's placing the crime next to them rather than on them. And the man who wishes under any specious pretenses to overturn the liberty of our country and who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising republic in blood, by thus determining and thus acting, you will pursue the plain and direct road to the attainment of your wishes. You men, doing the right thing, will defeat the insidious designs of our enemies, who are compelled to resort from open force to secret artifice. And you men will give one more distinguished proof of unexampled patriotism and patient virtue. You will rise superior to the pressure of your most complicated sufferings. And think about everybody who died in the Revolution. They suffered more than you're suffering right now simply because you haven't been paid. Right? Don't let them have died for nothing. These were your brethren who died. They gave everything. And you will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world would never have seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. And he looks out at his men, and he's exhausted. He's given this long speech. I just gave you the very last paragraph. He's given this long speech, and all of his men are just staring at it, blank. They seem not to have been moved at all. And Washington's at a total loss. And so he reaches into his breast pocket in his suit coat, and he pulls out a sheet of paper, which is the promise from Congress that they will pay. And he also pulls out his eyeglasses, which no one except his aide, John Marshall, later Supreme Court Chief Justice, has ever seen. And he puts on his glasses in front of all of his men, and he says, "Gentlemen, forgive me. For I have not only grown gray in the service of my country, I have also grown blind." And his men break down crying at that moment. It changes everything. And I can't stress how important this is. Washington. What if Washington had said, yeah, let's go take down Congress. I'd love to be dictator. I'd love to be as great as George III. I'd love to have an empire. And by God, I've got the army right here with me. Let's do it. I mean, can you imagine how different the world would be? And how many men would stand there like George Washington and not only not take all the power handed to them, but convince the very men who want to give him that power that this is not what Republicans do. Republicans do not do this. Republicans make the right decision, even when it means you're not going to be paid for several more months or another year, even when it means you have to wait for a long time for this thing to be put in place. Right? But Washington, that great man, is able to convince his own army that this thing has to be done this way. So this is where the example of the Aeneid, the example of Cincinnatus, these aren't just stories. These are stories that have an absolute moral quality to them that shape our very behavior and the way that we think, right? The way that we make our own decisions. And would we expect our president now, would we expect our politicians to behave in a less ethical way? We have every right to demand the highest ethics and morality from every one of our officers in government. Doesn't matter Supreme Court or the House of Representatives or the Senate or the presidency. They owe us the example of their ethics. They owe us the example of their morality. That's what Washington is telling us, right? And that's true for every one of us at every point. So we're running out of time. Let's quickly look at George Washington's farewell address, which of course he gives in 1797 in the last days in March of that year as he steps down from the presidency and hands it over to his successor, to John Adams. And I want to point out two things in his farewell address. So please turn to page 221. Starting with that first full paragraph I have already intimated to you. So Washington warns about two things in his farewell address. And by the way, this address that he gives here, it's not nearly as good as the address he gave to his men at Newburgh, New York on the Ides of March. And probably Alexander Hamilton wrote this farewell address, but it is regarded as the most important farewell address given in American history, not just because it's the first, but because of what it says. It's also regarded, I think, by everybody, even people who would disagree with it. It's regarded as one of the greatest speeches ever given in American history, and partly because of what it says. He tells us right there on line 16 on page 221, I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. And if you jump down to the bottom of the next paragraph, this is truly our worst enemy, right? This idea, and that is very, especially at a place like Hillsdale, where we're intimately tied to the founding of the Republican Party, and I know that there's a very active political presence on campus. But Washington said, and this was the way that things were really until the 1820s, he said, be very careful about the spirit of party. The moment that you have parties, you've created a situation in which it's us versus them, and it means that the republic, the res publica, the common good, is automatically fractured. So beware the baneful effects of party. This is a very dangerous thing to have. And I don't think, without us being political, I don't think any one of us can look at our current situation and not see the danger of parties. Both sides cannot speak to the other side. And they're just shouting at one another. They're yelling and tweeting at one another, but they're not actually in any kind of dialogue at that moment. And it's been that way for several years, but we're at a really dangerous point in our history. Unless the parties start speaking to one another again and finding common ground, we are really in trouble. And that's exactly what Washington is warning us about. Be careful about this. But then he gives us a second warning. And this is on page 223. And hopefully you had a chance to read this. If not, make sure you read it carefully. But right here at the bottom there, that last paragraph on 223, all the way over to page 225, and especially that middle paragraph there, and let's jump to that on page 225, line 15. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith, but here let us stop. And Washington takes this to the extreme. He says that an American foreign policy, a Republican foreign policy, demands that we never entangle ourselves with another country unless it is a fellow republic. Only fellow republics can we trust. But of course, at the time period that we're talking, we're the only republic. So only republics can we trust. Only they will we understand a kind of true brotherhood of position. But he's trying to avoid us being involved with either Britain or France at this time. And the rule is have commercial relations with everybody, but political relations with no one. Now that, for me growing up as an anti-Soviet, anti-communist, that's a hard lesson to learn. But think about, again, where we are. This election, what country was more important than any other country? China, right? It was everywhere in the election. Previous election, it was Russia. Right? And think about how influential those powers are and how important they become, especially when they become combined with the spirit of party. And so you have the spirit of party and the spirit of foreign alliance or foreign hatred. And Washington is saying we need to avoid both. We need to avoid both that hatred of other powers, but also that adoration of other powers. So I would ask you guys to read this very carefully, because Washington lays out exactly why we have to be careful about foreign policy. Okay, so let's finish there. Let me just say this. And I realize that there's maybe a little bit of hero worship in my talk today, but I do think Washington deserves it. We're coming up on his birthday on February 22nd. We're coming up on his birthday. I would stress that we would be a radically different people had Washington not been our first president. And we would be a radically different people had Washington not been the president of the Constitutional Convention and had he not been our general in charge of the army. This is a man who turns down ultimate power. And those men are so rare in history. They're so rare. I mean, we can count them on one hand when we think about people who are willing to turn down that kind of power. And his idea was not that there would just be a vacuum of power, but power would revert to us as individuals, and we would have that dignity of personhood in all of this. And even on the issue, the most controversial issue of the day, which we talked about on Monday, even on slavery, Washington gets this right. At the end of his career, he takes his estate and he divides it among all of his slaves. He frees all of his slaves and he divides all of his wealth among his slaves. And he gives them tons of property in Ohio so that they can start over away from white Virginia, have a new history, a frontier history. They can start over and they can create their own free black communities in which they can be educated and have their own prosperity. And Washington's estate did not stop paying his ex-slaves until 1832. For 33 years, his estate paid this out after freeing all of his slaves. So it took him a while to get to that position, but in the end, he did the right thing. And so here, there's an example we can be proud of, incredibly proud. We don't have to be embarrassed and say, but he was a slaveholder. He was, but in the end, he rectified that problem as well and did it with great dignity. So, Washington. All right, thanks everybody. God bless. Have a good Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, we'll talk about the French Revolution and Edinburgh.